When I was 9 years old, this would have been the early 90s, my family and I lived in a house with a fairly big wooded area behind our backyard. I say fairly big because it wasn't big enough that you could really get lost in it for very long, but it was big enough that you could walk into it for a good 20 minutes before making it to the center. It got pretty thick in some areas and you couldn't see any of the houses from the neighborhoods once inside. To my friends and I, it was a magical world. We played in those woods all summer long. My mom would let us go in there as long as we were back by sundown. Like I said, this was the early 90s, and times were a little different then. My best friend would come over and we would run over there and play for hours. We played hide and seek, army, Star Wars, and anything we could think of. But our very favorite thing to do was climb trees. We had a favorite tree to climb. It was a huge pine out towards the middle of the woods. The branches at the bottom were low enough that we could grab on and pull ourselves up. And the branches leading up were all very strong, and we could climb really high and see a view from above most of the other trees. Sometimes when I got bored at home, I'd go out there by myself. I climbed real high in that tree and just think about stuff. I loved being up there, it was just so peaceful and calm. One Sunday I decided to go out on a solo mission in the evening. I knew I didn't have too long before dark, so I hurried into the woods to get a good climb in. I was up in my spot in no time. I remember it was late summer, and the weather was still warm late into the evening. I wanted to be able to see a little bit of sunset, and then I climbed down and hurried home. I just sat up there and daydreamed, as I waited for the sun to begin to set. Then, I heard a twig snap on the ground, and I looked straight down, and I saw a man standing at the base of the tree looking up at me. I remember he was wearing a filthy brown jacket, and he had a patchy beard. His hair was sticking up at random places, looking like he had been relentlessly running his fingers through it. He was just staring at me with a bizarre expression that seemed to be one of wonder and delight. It was an extremely unnerving look, almost a look of someone that just realized they stumbled across the gold at the end of the rainbow. That's the only way I can describe it. It made my blood run cold. I was completely numb. I didn't know how long he had been watching me before I noticed him. Thinking about that still makes me shiver. We stared at each other for a moment. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. It sounds strange, but I didn't want to scream or tell him to go away, because I had this feeling that told me not to provoke him in any way. After a few minutes, he said, "Are you coming down anytime soon?" I shook my head back and forth. I didn't know what to say to him. It was clear I was very uncomfortable at this point, and that should be enough to make a decent person go away, but he only grinned at me. Then he reached his hand up and grabbed the bottom branch of the tree, as if to test to see if it could hold him. I do believe he may have been planning to climb up to me, but the lowest branch was flimsy, and it was not strong enough to hold a grown adult. He soon realized this and gave up, but I had seen enough. I finally broke my silence and started to yell for someone for help. I kept screaming and screaming. The man backed away a step or two from the tree and began to mumble and curse under his breath. He flailed his arm in the air in a rage and began making a motion like he was pushing an invisible person in front of him. Eventually he turned and walked away, sort of stumbling with each step. I don't think anybody heard my cries because nobody came to help me. I stayed up in that tree for what felt like hours because I wasn't sure if he was really gone. Finally, I climbed down because the sun was beginning to set, and I couldn't bear to be out there all night. I hit the ground and bolted back to my house, positive that he would pop out from a shadow and grab me. He never did. I made it home and told my parents. My dad went out to look in the woods, but he never saw anything. We stayed in the house for about another 2 years before we moved across town to a bigger house. I never played in those woods again for the rest of our time there. I still think about that man sometimes. What would he have done if I had come down? I have no idea, but that question does keep me up some nights. I'm a hunter, and I like to hunt wild boar specifically. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you that don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more pigs. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my states, it's illegal to hunt most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I'd been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope that costs literally twice as much as the rifle I was mounting it on was worth it. But I did it. I took it to a range and sighted it in. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity that I knew would be perfect for a night hunt. It was easily accessible with my truck, with easy to find spots that I could set up in that overlooked a large, easy to navigate clearing. The night started uneventful, mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot I had seen days earlier that probably wasn't much better than my first. But it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around with my new scope. After an hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me. This spot doesn't have much animal activity at all. No rabbits or owls. The deer that I had seen were hundreds of yards from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night, but lively in the day? I set up around 10 p.m. It was about 2 a.m. when I started to think about packing. Maybe setting up a target before I left and taking some practice shots. I heard a crunch from the direction I came from before. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the Predator movies. I adjusted my range and zoomed in a little. I remember jolting a little when I saw that it wasn't really a bear. It was a man. Because he was so low and hunched over, I thought I was looking at a young bear. Is that a game warden? It couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where could he have walked from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights. I noticed he was naked. No shoes, pants, or anything. I remember being disturbed by his movements, like a squirrel or something. Twitchy and grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming the tree. Was that my tree? The one I had been leaning against earlier? The thought terrified me. Could he smell me? Then he did something I still have nightmares about today. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet and stared straight up like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it, a voice coming from that direction. A very compelling female voice.
Help, I'm lost. Help, please, I'm lost.
There was a long pause, but neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights were trained on the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything I had been taught about firearms. Were they lost? Was this some guy that had just gone crazy out there? Why was his voice so feminine?
Help, please, I can't walk.
The voice called out. That's when I called bullshit. Not only could he walk, but when I first saw him, he was traversing the land with ease for a naked person. So good, I mistook him for a bear. That's a fucking trap. This guy's trying to lure me to him with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, the lack of activity before had caused me to pack up most of my gear. I think I may have left behind a hat and a sitting pad, but I didn't give a shit at that moment. I took my eyes off of him for a moment to get my pack on. I buckled my chest strap and scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the same position, but his face was staring in my direction. And I swear, I saw a smile. The thermal scope has an effect that makes the animal's eyes appear white. How the hell had he heard me get up and put my gear on? He must have easily been 150 yards away.
Fuck off.
I screamed in that direction. He stood upright and it hit me how tall and skinny he was. Easily 6 foot and very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky as hell, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I tell the cops? I was unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and hunched down on all fours.
The next one will fuck you up. Go away.
He stayed on all fours, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of him. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat or something. I was trying to stop my trembling and knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. I was terrified. That standoff probably only lasted a minute or two, maybe less, but it felt like forever. In an instant, he bolted left towards the tree line opposite the road. So much for not being able to walk. I could barely keep him in my scope. He was moving so fast. He disappeared into the brush and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round and tried to pocket that mag and swap for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother looking for it. I wasn't far from my truck and I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, yelling in this weird sound that could have been a cry or a laugh. I scrambled up the trail and arrived at my truck breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab but kept a rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time, I told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land, like some kind of caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone, never receiving an update. It wasn't until I told this story on a camping trip that my nephew told me about Wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story scared the piss out of him because the spot we were camping was technically the same forest I'd seen the bastard, just 50 miles east of it. He was so spooked, his mom had to take him home. She was really pissed. I've gone down the rabbit hole of these scary stories. I'm not saying what I saw definitely was a Wendigo or skinwalker. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet that night. Back in the summer of 2015, my friend Kate and I were coming home from a trip with her parents to a resort town in the mountains famous for skiing for a couple of days. The highway to get there wasn't too bad, as it had some significant upgrades for a big athletic contest our city had hosted a couple of years prior. However, it still cuts through some relatively remote terrain, and it's not uncommon to see deers and bears on the side. Her parents wanted to go hike up to a lake near the highway between the town and the larger city where we lived, so we pull off the road and park in a small parking lot. This was not an official swimming lake, and a logging company used the parking lot, so although we were allowed to be there, there was no one else in the lot, and it's not well known. So we all piled out of the car and started figuring out what we needed to throw in our backpacks for the hike and swim, as we had not planned this when we had left our rental. Out of the corner of our eyes, we noticed a man walking out of the woods on a small dirt road that's snaking away from the logging camp and our intended hiking area. He comes up to the car and starts to explain that he had been up the road cleaning up a campsite he and his friends had been staying at, and even though where they were camping was illegal, he wanted to come back after and make sure it's clean. Unfortunately, after cleaning up, his car battery had died, and asked if we could drive up the road to the campsite and jumpstart the car for him. He says he doesn't want to call for CAA as we were in a pretty deserted area of the highway, and he doesn't want to get in trouble for camping illegally. There was something extremely odd about him and his mannerisms to me. However, I can't exactly explain why, but from being a reasonably attractive female in my mid-20s and dealing with creepy guys often enough, all of my instincts were yelling at me not to follow this man into the woods. I remember that he was oddly specific about the make and model of his car that had broken down, repeating it multiple times, and that it was only a minute or two drive down the dirt road. Kate's parents are amicable and agree right away to go and give him a jump. Without waiting, he states that he will meet us at the car and points down the road, saying again that it's only a 2 to 3 minute walk down the road. However, being raised on cold case files and law and order marathons, I did not want to get into the car or go into the woods. Not wanting to make a scene, I suggested that Kate and I walk over to the small bridge we had crossed to enter the parking lot and take some photos. So she and I walk over there, and I start freaking out and telling her that something felt off and I didn't like what was going on. I began texting another friend telling him where we are and that if I stopped texting him to call the police and tell them what was happening. Cell phone service in that area would be super spotty. I was just praying that he would be getting my messages too, because all the hair on the back of my neck was standing on end at this point. Meanwhile, her parents had gotten back into their vehicle and had driven down the dirt road to find the car. About 5 minutes later, we hear their car honking. They had gone down the road slowly and they hadn't seen the man or the car or the campsite. There was no trace of anyone. We see her parents' car back up down the dirt road and then drive down another road honking again. Her parents went up and down a couple of small dirt roads for maybe another 5 minutes trying to find this man and his dead car, but they couldn't find him, and he never responded to their honks. At this point, Kate and I are getting very agitated by the strange circumstances and just want our parents to come back. When they do, I flat out state that I was highly uncomfortable with what had just happened and did not want to continue with our planned hike into the woods. They were spooked too and agreed to get out of the area, and we ended up stopping a while further down the highway at a much more popular provincial park lake. I have no idea what was going on that day, what would have happened if Kate and I had gotten into the car to go with our parents. but I feel seriously lucky that we didn't find out.